They didn't chain her, but they may as well have. The cold hiss of the shuttle doors echoed through the docking bay as Isla stepped into the harsh light of Station EO7. The artificial gravity settled uncomfortably in her joints, slightly heavier than what her body was used to. A tremor passed through her spine, but she didn't let it show. She held her head high, violet skin catching in the sterile light, the long cascade of her black hair brushing against the rough gray fabric of her uniform. No weapons, no luggage, no identity, aside from the code burned into the corner of her collar. She wasn't a soldier. Not anymore. Now, she was a reward. The two armored Earth soldiers flanking her didn't speak as they led her through the narrow corridor, lined in pale steel, humming faintly with the station's pulse. It smelled like ozone and sterilization fluid, a place untouched by nature, where nothing lived unless it was meant to serve. At the end of the hall, he was waiting. Dr. Elias Ronan, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a simple utility suit, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows. He looked like a man who'd once been more than he was now, and had learned how to live with less. The lines around his mouth and the hollows beneath his eyes gave him the look of someone who had survived something that still hadn't ended. His gaze landed on her without flinching. Not cruel, but not welcoming either. Cautious. Cold. The soldier nearest to him gestured lazily toward her. "Your delivery, sir. Fresh off the Haraxian transport. Command says she's yours now. Spoils of war and all that." Isla didn't flinch, but her jaw tightened. The words were familiar by now. Yours now. Like she was a tool. A trophy. A trained beast. Something handed off for a job well done. Dr. Ronan didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the soldier. "I didn't request this. Didn't have to." The man smirked. "SKB mission was a success because of your algorithms. Command decided you deserve something for the trouble. They sent me a living being. You want to send her back?" The soldier cocked his head. "I can, though Command probably won't take that well. She's not much use elsewhere." Ronan finally looked at her. Isla met his gaze directly. No fear, no warmth, just silent defiance. An unspoken reminder that she knew what this was, and she would not pretend otherwise. He let out a long breath, then turned back to the soldier. "I'll take it from here." The soldier grinned, gave Isla a mock salute, and left with heavy boots echoing down the corridor. The silence that followed was louder than the footsteps. Isla stayed where she was, not moving, not speaking. The man, her new keeper, watched her like he was waiting for her to do something threatening. Her kind had that reputation. The Aranics were known for their senses, their speed, and most of all, their wrath. She had inherited all three, but what he didn't see was what she had lost. After a long pause, Ronan spoke. "You don't have to be afraid." I don't follow the reward system." She raised a single brow. "But you're still part of it." He went slightly, just enough that she saw it. "I don't like the system either, but it's kept this station supplied. That's the compromise." Compromise. That was what they called it now. Enslavement under a new name. Every breath she took on this station was bought with someone else's silence. He gestured down the hallway. "You'll have quarters, separate from mine. You'll be given access to the station systems gradually, as trust allows. There are no guards here. No surveillance, except for what Earth Command occasionally taps in for. And if I don't cooperate..." Her voice was cool, but there was fire behind it. Not threat, more challenge. "Then I submit a return order," he said evenly. "And they send you back to the camps." She didn't respond. Didn't need to. The silence said it all. They walked in silence through the narrow halls. Lights buzzed overhead, flickering occasionally. The station was old. Not neglected, but stripped down. Every corner was functional. No art. No softness. No place for comfort. The door to her quarters slid open with a soft whir. It was barely more than a capsule. Cot, console, a narrow wall locker, and a small shelf. "You'll find everything you need here," he said. She stepped inside, touching nothing. "Do you expect me to thank you for the luxury?" she asked. He leaned against the doorframe. "No, I expect you to survive." The words hung between them. That had been her whole life, surviving. Since the first bombardments on her planet, since the surrender, since the treaties signed in ashes and bone, since the moment her people were reclassified, not enemy combatants, but assets. Resources. He looked like he wanted to say something else, but didn't. Instead, he turned to leave. Wait. He paused. Isla's voice was quieter now. Not soft, never soft, but laced with something older. Something tired. Why didn't you send me back? He didn't turn. Because I don't know what that would make me. And then he walked away. She stood in the center of the room for a long time after the door sealed, shut behind him. The silence in the station wasn't clean. It was heavy, alive with the hum of distant systems and the whisper of recycled air. Too quiet to be peaceful. She didn't sit, didn't rest. Instead, she moved to the console and pulled up a system map. She memorized the layout in minutes. The Aaronics were trained for this. Efficiency, awareness, adaptation. They had once fought to the brink of extinction with these gifts. Now they were used to keep her alive in a place where death might be mercy. Later, she wandered into the central hub, half curiosity, half caution. She didn't expect to find Ronan there, hunched over a diagnostics panel, sleeves rolled up, hands steady despite the flickering screen. He glanced up but didn't speak. She approached slowly, watching the interface. It was crude by Aaronic standards. Manual code insertion, physical repair ports. Inefficient, but it worked. Earth tech always worked, even if it limped. You need to reroute that line, she said, gesturing with her chin. He glanced at the wiring. I was getting there. She didn't argue. She reached past him, fingers grazing his as she adjusted the interface. It was the lightest touch, skin on skin. Just a moment, but the moment stayed. His hand jerked slightly, not from fear, but from surprise. She pulled hers back with precision, but something lingered in the space between them. A tension neither of them named. He cleared his throat. You've worked with this system before? No, but I know how to listen. To what? She looked at him, really looked at him. His face was hard but not cruel. He wore his silence like armor, but she could see the cracks. Loss, guilt, isolation. To the things people don't say, she answered. He didn't respond, but something in his posture changed. Less guarded, still not open, but listening. When she returned to her quarters that night, she lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling. The touch haunted her, not because it was romantic, but because it had been real. Not violence, not command, just contact. And that was what frightened her most. Because if there was still something in her that could respond to simple touch, then what else had survived? The war had taken everything. Her name, her family, her planet. It had replaced them with silence and servitude. But this place, this man, was something different. Not better, just unknown. And that made it dangerous. As she closed her eyes, she didn't think of escape. Not yet. She thought of the way his skin had felt, warm, calloused, human. And for the first time in years, she dreamed without fire. The power failure came without warning. One moment the station was steady and still, humming in its usual dull monotony. The next, lights flickered then went dark. A sharp lurch rolled through the floors like a tremor. Not enough to throw her off her feet, but enough to make Isla's stomach twist. The overhead lights died in unison, replaced by the soft glow of emergency strips lining the walls in a dim, blood-red hue. She didn't panic. Instinct wouldn't allow it. Instead, Isla moved swiftly toward the corridor, where the air had shifted, tightened, almost as if it were holding its breath. The metallic scent of ozone and heat was growing stronger. She turned a corner, already piecing together what had failed, probably a surge in the oxygen processor or power relay junction near the lower maintenance decks. Primitive Earth tech always broke under stress. And then she heard it, a distant groan of stressed metal. Pressure imbalance. Isla sprinted. When she reached the junction hall, she saw it at once. A rupture in the conduit casing had blown a fist-sized hole into the outer corridor bulkhead. The automated sealant foam was already hissing to life, but the rupture was still venting heat and radiation. The wall was glowing, and someone was there. Dr. Ronan, crouched by control panel, his arm jammed into an access slot, working blind. A faint tremble in his hand betrayed the pain. Isla didn't call out. She just ran to him, dropping to her knees and pushing aside the access panel. He looked at her in surprise, eyes wide. the dim light reflecting off the sheen of sweat on his forehead. "You shouldn't be here," he said tightly. "And you should," she shot back. His jaw clenched. "The safety sealant's failing. We have about 30 seconds before the pressure equalizes, and we get torn apart." She didn't hesitate. Her hands darted to the wiring he was struggling with. The connections were archaic but familiar. She'd rewired systems under fire before, back when her people still had ships in the sky. Before their surrender, before being made prizes. "Give me your multi-tool," she said. He hesitated, just a breath, then handed it over. Working fast, Isla spliced 2 wires and rerouted the damaged circuit through an auxiliary path. The conduit's glow dulled. The bulkhead seal shuddered and locked into place with a sharp hiss. The station stabilized. For a long moment, there was only the sound of their breathing, heavy, uneven, alive. Then Ronan laughed. A short, dry sound, like it had been locked in his throat too long. "I didn't think we'd pull that off." She sat back on her heels, heart pounding. "You didn't." "I did." He glanced at her, surprised, but didn't argue. "I'm not some decoration, doctor," she said quietly. "They call me dangerous because I am." Ronan didn't reply right away. Instead, he looked at her, not with fear, but with something else. Respect, maybe, or curiosity. Something that didn't quite have a name yet. They stayed there in the red light for a long moment, side by side, both realizing how close they had come to being erased in silence. Eventually, he stood. She followed. "I should check the system diagnostics," he muttered. "I'll come with you," she said, her voice steady. They walked back through the corridor, steps falling into rhythm. The power returned as they reached the control room, flickering lights warming to full strength. The station breathed again. So did she. Inside, Ronan moved toward the main console, typing commands with a steady, if still sore hand. Isla stood near the viewport. There was no real view, just the black ocean of space beyond the reinforced glass. No stars, no planets. Just void. "How long have you been here?" she asked. He glanced up from the console. 3 years. Give or take. "Alone." "Mostly." She turned to face him. "That doesn't bother you?" "I prefer it," he said flatly. She didn't believe him. There was silence between them again, but not the hostile kind. The air felt different now. Not warm, but not cold either. He wasn't ignoring her presence anymore. And she wasn't pretending to be indifferent. She walked closer to him, slowly. Measured steps. "I used to fly," she said, her voice softer now, distant. "Scouts. Fast, agile, designed for precision strikes. I trained for 6 years. Fought for 4. Then we lost the war, and they grounded us. Stripped our ships. Stripped our names. Told us we weren't warriors anymore. We were property." He turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "I wasn't supposed to be captured," she went on. "I was supposed to die in orbit. My flight path was calculated for a suicide burn into your battleship. But I hesitated. One breath. That's all it took. One breath, and now I'm here." She laughed bitterly, a sharp exhale that had nothing to do with humor. "Maybe I wanted to live," she added. "Or maybe I was just afraid." Ronan didn't offer sympathy. He didn't try to reassure her. He just stepped closer, carefully, as if approaching something fragile. "You're not property here," he said finally. "Not to me." She looked up at him, something uncertain flickering in her gaze. "You say that now. But what happens when command checks in? When they ask how you're managing your reward?" Ronan held her eyes. Let them ask. It wasn't bravado. It was quiet defiance. And it meant more than he probably realized. Then, for the first time since she arrived, Isla's voice broke, just slightly. "You don't know what they've done to us." "I've seen enough," he said, to know it was wrong. There was a pause. Heavy, but not unbearable. Her eyes dropped. Her expression shifted, and he realized she was fighting something. Not anger, not fear, tears. And then, without thinking, he stepped forward and lifted a hand, hesitating just before touching her face, giving her the chance to move away. She didn't. His fingers brushed her cheek, thumb catching a single tear as it fell. Her skin was warm, smooth, humming faintly with the strange energy of her kind. Her breath caught. His hand stilled. They stood there, locked in a moment neither had meant to reach. She closed her eyes, just for a second, and then she stepped back. The distance returned, not out of fear, but choice. I don't need comfort, she said quietly. He nodded. I know. She turned and left the room without another word. Ronan watched the door slide shut behind her, hand still hanging uselessly at his side. He didn't follow. In the silence that followed, he heard something else. The station's quiet hum, steady again. But now it sounded different, like something inside it had shifted. Repaired, maybe, or cracked. In her quarters, Isla sat on the cot, hands in her lap, eyes unfocused. Her people believed that souls could fracture without breaking, that pain could live in silence for years and still grow like a root beneath the skin. She wasn't sure if what she'd felt was mercy or weakness. But when his hand had touched her face, it hadn't felt like a claim. It had felt kind. She hated that she wanted to feel it again. She hated that, for the first time in years, she didn't feel entirely alone. And that, more than anything, was the most dangerous thing of all. The silence after their touch lingered like static in the air. Too quiet, too full. For the next 2 days, Isla and Dr. Ronan moved around each other with deliberate distance. They spoke only when necessary, kept their gazes elsewhere. Yet the memory of that single moment, his hand brushing her cheek, her skin remembering the warmth, refused to fade. It pulsed in the quiet, between footsteps in the halls, between half-finished sentences, and the way their fingers nearly touched when passing tools. Isla didn't understand why it stayed with her. She had endured captivity, interrogation, and silence designed to strip her identity down to raw obedience. Yet this small, human gesture unraveled her in a way she hadn't prepared for. She spent most of her time in the auxiliary engine bay, where systems were slow to stabilize after the last failure. She liked it there, cramped, warm, mechanical. Things made sense in machinery. Fault could be traced, fixed. Reactions followed rules. People weren't like that, especially not Ronan. The man confused her. He showed kindness without softness. He didn't leer, didn't dominate, didn't hide behind rank. And yet, he kept so much locked inside, like a ship with sealed bulkheads holding back floodwaters. The storm came sooner than expected. She had just sealed a coolant valve when the alarm clanged to life, sharp and shrill, different from the usual alerts. A gas leak, not catastrophic, but enough to trigger emergency protocols. She ran to the command hub, where Ronan was already at the main console, typing fast. The lighting flickered in pulses of red and white. It's in the galley sector, he said, glancing her way. See O2 line rupture. Containment's automatic, but if the override failed. He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. They sprinted together, instincts aligned without words. When they reached the affected corridor, the air was already thin. Frost gathered on the metal walls. Isla's lungs protested, but she pushed through it. Inside the galley, the rupture gushed cold gas like a white serpent, coiling in the artificial gravity. Ronan dove for the manual override. Isla dropped to the floor and crawled beneath the vent panel, working by feel. 2 bolts left, she muttered, coughing. I need the sealant. Coming. He tossed the cartridge, and her hand snapped it out of the air without looking. She hissed the compound into the cracked pipe, sealing it just as the pressure gauge on the wall blinked from red to yellow. Stabilized. They both collapsed onto the floor, coughing, heaving, gasping. The emergency lights finally dimmed. For a long moment, neither spoke. Just breath and heartbeat and the ache of adrenaline settling into muscle. Ronan turned his head toward her. You're reckless. I'm alive, she countered. You didn't have to. Neither did you. The words stopped him. They sat like that, backs to the wall, side by side in the dim cold. Finally, she asked, Why are you here? He blinked at her. What do you mean? This station. Alone. Isolated. They reward you, but keep you out of sight. Why? Ronan was silent for a while, jaw tight. Then, without looking at her, he spoke. I designed a targeting algorithm. That caught her off guard. For what? Smart bombs. Guided strikes. Clean kills, they called them. No collateral. I believed it. You don't now. He shook his head. One of my simulations, Escabee, was used during a negotiation ceasefire. They launched anyway. A misfire. They said, I don't think it was. She was quiet. The pieces settled into place. The reward, the isolation, the silence that wrapped around him like a second skin. They punished you, she said. He gave a hollow laugh. They rewarded me. This post was compensation. But they buried me out here so I wouldn't speak. Isla turned to face him. For the first time, she saw the war in his eyes, not in scars, but in silence. Not in anger, but in guilt. I've killed two, she said quietly. He looked at her, but didn't interrupt. 3 Earth cruisers, one with a civilian relay. We didn't know. At least, that's what we told ourselves. We were trained to strike first, ask later. There was no time for grief, no room for doubt. Then the war ended, and suddenly everyone had time to judge. Ronan didn't flinch. You regret it? I regret hesitating. He frowned, unsure what to make of that. She leaned her head back against the wall. If I died with my squadron, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be this. He studied her for a moment, then said, I don't know what this is, but it's not what they said it would be. That caught her off guard. Her chest tightened with something unfamiliar. Hope, maybe. Or its dangerous cousin, trust. Ronan stood, offering her a hand. She stared at it, then cautiously took it. He pulled her to her feet, and for a second, they were close again. Too close. The memory of that first touch echoed between them like a pulse. Neither moved. Neither spoke. This time, it was Isla who broke the stillness. Her hand drifted up, slowly, not quite a caress. She brushed her fingers over the scar on his temple. A thin, pale line, barely visible in the low light. His breath caught. From Escaby? She asked. He nodded. She traced it lightly, then let her hand fall. When she stepped back, the space between them felt heavier than it had before. Charged. He didn't stop her from walking away. But this time, he followed her with his eyes until she disappeared around the corner. In her room, Isla sat at the edge of her cot, heart hammering. She stared at her hands, as if trying to understand why they had trembled. She wasn't supposed to feel this. Not here. Not now. Her people warned against it. Attachment, softness, letting the enemy become anything more than a target. But he wasn't the enemy anymore, and neither was she. Something was unraveling. Slowly, quietly. Not a collapse, but a shift. One touch had started it. Now, a look, a shared breath, a story too painful to tell. These were adding weight to the shape they were forming. Whatever it was, she closed her eyes. Tomorrow, they'd return to duty. The station needed them. The systems were always breaking, always in need of fixing. But tonight, something else had been repaired, and neither of them quite knew what to do with it. The air between them had shifted, quietly, but unmistakably. It wasn't the silence of avoidance anymore. It wasn't born from mistrust or the fragility of unfamiliar territory. Now, when Isla and Ronan moved through the corridors of EO7, there was something alive in the space between them. It wasn't spoken aloud, but it hummed like power through a live wire, unpredictable, waiting. That morning, Isla was calibrating the outer relay sensors, her hands steady even as the entire station thrummed with static tension from an incoming radiation surge. Her violet skin glistened faintly in the dim light. The dark strands of her hair pulled back and tucked behind pointed ears. Ronan stood beside her, monitoring the fluctuations on a handheld panel, but every now and then, his eyes flicked toward her, not because of what she was doing, but because of who she was. She felt it, and she didn't look away. You're distracting, she said, not looking up from the panel. He blinked. Me? Yes. Your thoughts are too loud. He gave a half smile, dry but unguarded. I didn't say anything. You didn't have to. They worked in sync, almost effortlessly now. Commands passed between them in fragments, gestures, unfinished words that needed no explanation. The distance that once felt necessary had started to dissolve, replaced by something else, something neither of them had chosen, but both had allowed. Later, they found themselves in the hydroponics bay, one of the few areas where life still grew, barely. The station's plants were hardy and uninspiring, grown for function, not beauty. But the place had a warmth to it, a humidity that softened the metallic chill that clung to every other corner of EO7. Isla knelt beside a root bed, gloved fingers pressing into the synthetic soil, testing moisture levels. Ronan leaned against the wall nearby, arms crossed. You don't have to help here. The system's automated. She didn't look up. The system's inefficient. He chuckled softly. Of course you'd notice. I notice everything, she replied, especially when it breaks. Ronan stepped forward, crouching beside her. The air between them shifted again, closer this time. More charged. You don't talk much about your people, he said carefully. Her hands paused, then resumed. Because they're gone. Some survived, didn't they? After the surrender. Survival isn't the same as living, she said, her voice low. What's left of them is scattered, silenced, waiting for Earth to decide if they're useful again. She stood abruptly, brushing soil from her gloves. And even the ones who fought, who earned respect on the battlefield, were reduced to rewards. Her words hit harder than she intended. She turned away, pacing the narrow path between nutrient tanks. Ronan watched her, his voice quiet. You weren't supposed to be here. She stopped. No, I wasn't. Then why are you still here? She looked at him, not with anger, but with something raw and exposed. Because the alternative was worse. He didn't press. Instead, he stepped closer, just close enough that the space between them vibrated with tension. I'm not trying to tame you. He said. I don't want obedience. Then what do you want? He hesitated, and for the first time, he said the truth. I want you to stop looking at me like I'm the cage. Isla's breath caught. She turned toward him, slowly, expression unreadable. Her eyes, deep violet and flecked with silver, locked onto his. There was fire in them, but it wasn't the fire of fury. It was hunger, hesitation, hope. She stepped forward, her hand brushing against his arm, barely a touch, yet it set his nerves on fire. He didn't pull away. Her voice was quiet. You touched me once. Yes. Not like a commander. Not like someone who owned me. I never did. I know. She reached up then, her fingers curling lightly around the collar of his shirt. So why are you standing still? That was the moment. The line they had tiptoed around for days finally dissolved. He closed the distance between them, not with force, but with certainty. Their lips met like the breath they'd both been holding for too long. It wasn't gentle, but it wasn't rough either. It was desperate and cautious, built from tension stretched thin over time. A collision of emotion, of pain and survival, and something deeper that neither had dared name. When they broke apart, she didn't move. Her forehead rested lightly against his chest, and his arm stayed around her, hands open, not gripping, just holding. I shouldn't have done that, she murmured. But you did. She looked up. So did you. Do you regret it? A pause. No, she said, but I don't know what it means. He nodded. Neither do I. They stood there, in the middle of a half-dead garden, surrounded by filtered light and the quiet hum of machinery that had seen too much and lasted too long. Eventually, they stepped apart, not because the moment ended, but because the world would still keep moving, even if they didn't. That night, Isla lay awake in her quarters, staring at the ceiling. She could still feel the warmth of his hands, the taste of that kiss, the way it had unraveled something buried deep inside her. She wasn't supposed to fall for a human. She wasn't supposed to feel anything at all. But something was happening. Slowly, steadily. Not weakness. Not submission. Something closer to becoming whole again. And for the first time, she wondered if healing could feel like this. Messy, unexpected, quietly alive in the shadow of war. The station had never felt so still. After the kiss, after the electricity of that moment in the hydroponics bay, something subtle had shifted between Isla and Ronan. Not broken, not unspoken either, just changed, like a tide quietly retreating from the shore, leaving behind new patterns in the sand. Neither of them addressed it directly. There were no confessions, no declarations, but their movements held a new awareness, an unspoken gravity. He didn't avoid her anymore. She didn't look away. There was a quiet understanding now, fragile but unmistakable. Then Earth Command reached out. The incoming transmission came without warning, cutting across all comm channels in a high-priority override. The screen in the control room blinked alive with a familiar seal, Earth Allied Command. Ronan was already there, standing stiff in front of the console as the message streamed in with sterile efficiency. Station EOS 7. Commander Elias Ronan. This is a standard status verification. Confirm condition of asset E579 and report compliance with behavioral regulations. A follow-up inspection vessel has been dispatched. Estimated arrival, 36 hours. Isla stood in the doorway, silent. The words hung in the air like smoke. Asset E579. They didn't even bother to use her name. Ronan didn't turn to look at her. He stared at the screen, jaw tight, fists clenched at his sides. The message looped again, then ended with a curt chime. The room was filled with that cold, humming silence unique to deep space, where sound had nowhere to go and tension had nowhere to hide. How often do they check in? Isla asked, voice steady. Ronan finally turned. They don't. Not like this. So, someone flagged something. Maybe the data stream picked up a deviation. A system glitch. Maybe they're just bored. She stepped further into the room. Or maybe they heard something. Maybe someone reported a shift. You think I told them? His voice wasn't defensive, just wounded. No, she said softly. But someone did. They looked at each other for a long time, the air thick with unsaid thoughts. Ronan broke first, turning away, pulling up the station logs. His hands moved quickly over the console, scanning systems, digging into subchannels. They've been pinging our comm relay for hours, he muttered. Low-frequency taps. Just monitoring, until now. Isla's mind raced. They're coming to evaluate me. They're coming to make sure I'm not humanizing you. She stiffened at that, a flash of cold anger rising in her chest. Because humanizing me would make you weak, disloyal, because it would make you dangerous. He turned back to her. They think emotions compromise containment. Attachment equals disobedience. And they're right, she said. That made him pause. She wasn't smiling, but her voice held a quiet edge of truth. What are you saying? He asked. I'm saying we don't have time to pretend nothing's happening between us. We had a moment, Ronan. Whatever it was, it broke their rules. Now we decide whether we bury it or act on it before they bury us. He stared at her, breathing slow and deep. You think they take you back? Reassign you? If we're lucky. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Her people didn't survive reassignment. At best, they were transferred to remote mines or used in biological research. At worst, they disappeared. Ronan rubbed his temple. We have 36 hours. That's not enough time to fake distance convincingly. I'm not faking anything. He looked up. Then what do we do? Isla walked to the console, her fingers dancing over the screen as she pulled up the station's central schematics. We disappear, she said. Ronan blinked. Into space. No, into the signal. She tapped a blinking node on the screen. There's a blind spot. It's where the comm array routes through a bypass node. It was added manually during a reroute last cycle. We hide the logs there, rework the internal footage, scramble our behavior patterns just enough to suggest a functional, but impersonal, working relationship. And if they board anyway, then we stall. Give them clean data, predictable answers. And if that fails, she finally looked at him again. Then we run. A long silence followed. Ronan stared at the map on the screen, then back at her. There was fear in his eyes, but also resolve. And something else. Something soft. Something that hadn't been there before she arrived. You've already thought about this, he said. I've been thinking about it since they handed me over like a crate of ammunition. He studied her, really studied her. The way her jaw tightened when she focused. The line between her brows when she was calculating outcomes. The bruises of old pain that never quite healed just covered themselves with instinct. I won't let them take you, he said. I'm not asking you to fight for me, Ronan. You're not, he said, but I will anyway. That silenced her. For a brief, charged moment, there was nothing between them but the low hum of the station and the weight of that promise. Then the emergency lighting flickered. Just once, but enough to make them both flinch. They're closer than we thought, Isla murmured. Ronan looked back to the console. We've got work to do. They move together now, not just in sync, but fused by a new urgency. Her fingers blurred across the data feeds, intercepting logs and splicing entries. His voice activated override codes to mask heat signatures and adjust audio captures. They were a team, not because they chose it, but because the alternative was worse. Hours passed. The station dimmed to its night cycle, but no one rested. In the quiet between commands, Isla spoke softly. Back in Hydroponics Bay, when I kissed you, Ronan froze just slightly. She continued, I wasn't testing you. I wasn't trying to manipulate you. I know. I meant it. I know that too. He didn't touch her. Didn't need to. The space between them hummed with meaning. Trust wasn't earned in grand gestures here. It lived in long hours, low light, and moments when no one else was watching. That night, Isla didn't return to her quarters. She stayed in the operations room, beside him, both of them awake beneath the red light of warning. Tomorrow, Earth Command would arrive. And when they did, they'd be watching for cracks. They wouldn't see what had already bloomed beneath the surface. Too carefully, too quietly to kill. But Isla knew better. Some things, once awakened, do not die quietly. The inspection vessel arrived with no ceremony. Just a ripple across the outer sensor field, a quiet ping of authorization, and the dull shudder of a docking clamp locking into place. Isla felt it like a pulse through the floor, metal against metal, the weight of Earth Command settling into the bones of the station. She stood at the central console beside Ronan as the airlock hissed open. Neither of them spoke. The three figures who entered wore polished, near black armor with silver thread insignias. Not soldiers, regulators. Bureaucrats trained for cold enforcement under the guise of protocol. Their leader, a man in his 50s with a face carved by self-importance, stepped forward with a tablet already active in his hand. Dr. Elias Ronan, he said without looking up, you are under routine review for compliance. We will require access to all logs, crew behavior records, and resource allocations. Physical confirmation of the asset is also required. Ronan didn't respond right away. He met Isla's eyes briefly, and she gave the slightest nod. She had already masked the system logs. They'd done everything they could. Now it came down to performance. I've prepared the files, Ronan said, voice flat. You'll find them organized by cycle. The man didn't smile. He gestured to one of his subordinates, who immediately connected a data spike into the terminal. A soft beep signaled the data transfer had begun. Where is the Aronix subject? I'm here. Isla's voice rang out, steady. The man finally looked at her. She was standing tall in the center of the room, posture rigid but proud. Her violet skin seemed to glow faintly under the sterile lights. Long black hair tied tightly at the nape of her neck. She was a vision of control, dangerous, perhaps, but contained. Asset 579, he said with clinical detachment. You've shown significant behavioral stability according to these logs. No signs of defiance, aggression, or ideological contamination. Isla said nothing. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a response. He stepped closer. Some on the committee questioned your placement here, especially with a civilian. They argued the risk of imprinting was too high. I'm not a pet, she replied coolly. No, he said, but your species does have a history of emotional transference under confinement. You bond quickly, unnaturally. That line sat there like bait. Ronan cut in. There's been no violation of protocol. No visible one, the inspector said, tapping through screens. But proximity has its effects. Physical interactions, shared workspaces, extended unsupervised exposure. All of these increase behavioral drift. She's contributed to the station, Ronan said. Without her, we wouldn't have survived the last power failure. She was sent here to serve her sentence, not to be praised. She wasn't sent here at all. She was given, like a trophy. The inspector's eyes narrowed, sharp as glass. That wasn't a complaint in your last review, because I hadn't seen her bleed for this place yet. A heavy silence followed, the kind where every breath feels louder than it should. Isla stared at Ronan, heart hammering, not out of fear, but because she knew what he was doing. He wasn't protecting her with silence anymore. He was fighting in plain sight. The inspector raised a brow. Is there something we should know, Doctor? No, Ronan said, but his voice lacked conviction. The man's tablet pinged. He glanced down at the screen. I see that your station logs were recently compressed. 3 days ago, an automatic cleanup triggered by storage overflow. Ronan kept his expression neutral. It happens. And yet, all security footage from the last 20 hours is corrupted. Ronan didn't flinch. She wasn't involved. If this is about asset management, then take it up with me. We will. The inspector stepped back, motioning to his crew. We'll finish the diagnostics and then begin internal scanning. Isla stiffened. Internal scanning meant deep system dives, layered audits, data reconstruction, voice analysis. They could find buried commands, clipped footage, even falsified biometric readings. She and Ronan exchanged a glance. They were out of time. Once the inspectors left the room, Isla moved fast. We can't let them run a full scan, she said. They'll find the data patch, and the thermal signatures from the hydroponics bay, and the adjusted audio logs. Once they cross-check the timelines, it's over. Ronan pulled up the system app. There's one option. She looked at him, reading the answer before he said it. The escape pod? He nodded. We flood the main systems with a decoy sequence. Make it look like you've sabotaged the station and tried to escape. I take responsibility. You disappear. No, Isla, you're not taking the fall for me. I already did the moment I let you in, he snapped. His voice cracked, not with anger, but fear. The kind of fear that knew what losing her would cost. She stepped forward, closer than was safe. I'm not running, she said. We're not running. Not separately. He met her gaze, and for a long, suspended second, neither of them spoke. Then she said it, barely more than a whisper. I love you. His breath caught, not because he hadn't felt it too, but because hearing it made it real. He closed the space between them. Not a kiss this time, just his forehead resting against hers, their hands wrapped tight around each other like anchors in a storm. We go together, he said, or not at all. The plan formed quickly after that. They disabled secondary logs, scrambled heat sensors, rerouted comm relays through a maintenance loop to broadcast false readings. Then, at the height of the inspection's final scan, they triggered a manual failsafe from the inner bay. A thermal overload warning echoed through the station. Temperature spike in reactor 2, the system barked. Evacuation recommended. The inspectors reacted fast, just as expected, rushing toward their ship, heads filled with risk protocol and procedure. Inside the confusion, Isla and Ronan slipped through the engineering access shaft and into the emergency pod dock. She activated the release protocol while he keyed in the trajectory override. The pod wasn't meant to go far, but far wasn't the goal. Just elsewhere. As the clamps disengaged and the pod detached with a jolt, Isla watched the station shrink in the viewport, surrounded by black. Then she looked at him. His hand was in hers. They were still breathing, still together, and finally free. The escape pod touched down in a burst of red dust and fractured silence. Isla braced herself against the side panel as the pod's landing stabilizers buckled on impact, skidding them across the rocky terrain. The jolt rattled her bones, but it was nothing compared to the weight she'd carried for years. Beside her, Ronan grunted, gripping the edge of his seat, his other hand still loosely entwined with hers. Neither let go, not during the crash, and not now. Outside, the world was unfamiliar. A scorched landscape under a pale, orange sky. Twin suns hovered low on the horizon, veiled behind smog-thick clouds. No vegetation, no structures. But the scans before their launch had shown breathable air and a mining outpost just 3 kilometers west. An independent colony, unregistered by Earth Command, loyal to no one. Freedom never looked like paradise. It wasn't supposed to. The hatch released with a sharp hiss. Heat poured in, dry and biting. Isla stepped out first, boots crunching into dust and gravel, her violet skin catching the strange light. Ronan followed, shouldering a small supply pack slung with makeshift rations, tools, and a last functioning medical scanner from the pod. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say yet. They were alive. The hike to the outpost was slow but steady. Isla moved with the precision of someone who had lived through much worse terrain. Her instincts sharp, always scanning the horizon. Ronan moved beside her, not trailing behind as she once feared he might. He didn't lead either. They walked together. By the time the colony came into view, both suns were dipping toward the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows over metal buildings half buried in sand. Faded paint peeled from reinforced walls. Solar panels were patched with salvaged glass. It wasn't much, but it was. Two armed guards spotted them as they approached, weapons lowered but ready. Travelers, one called. Or deserters? Isla stepped forward. Survivors. The other squinted. You military? No, Ronan said. Not anymore. A long pause followed, then a subtle nod. The guards let them pass. Inside, the outpost felt like a skeleton town, quiet but not dead. Engineers worked on broken wind turbines. Children with grease-streaked faces played in narrow alleys between solar collectors. Everyone looked like they had stories they didn't tell. Isla felt oddly at home. They were given a room, just one, temporary housing, but no one questioned why they shared it. Resources were limited, and space was currency. No one cared what they'd run from. Not here. That night, Isla sat on the bed, her back against the wall, knees pulled close. Ronan sat across from her, cross-legged on the floor, tinkering silently with a fried circuit from the escape pod. She watched him for a long time. They'll come looking, she said eventually. He nodded. But not here. Not soon. What if they do? Then we keep moving. You'd keep running? Her voice was quiet. For me, I'm not running from anything anymore, he said. I'm running with you. She closed her eyes at that, just briefly, like the words were more than she could take in one breath. Then she opened them again. I never wanted to survive the war. I know, but now that I have, she looked down at her hands. I don't know how to live. You learn, Ronan said softly, and you don't do it alone. There was a long silence, and then she asked, Do you regret it? Letting me in? No, he said immediately. You made me human again. After everything I built to forget that I was. She leaned her head back against the metal wall, staring at the cracked ceiling above. My name, before they took it, Minash Reborn, she said. Isla. My mother named me for the fires we were meant to rise from. But for a long time, I thought it was just a curse. Ronan stood and crossed the room, sitting beside her. It wasn't a curse, he said gently. It was a promise. She turned to him, eyes wide and unguarded for the first time. Do you really believe that? I believe you're not what they made you into. And I believe what we found in that station. He reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. Was real. She held his gaze. Then, without hesitation, she leaned into him. This time, the kiss was not born of desperation or adrenaline or the fear of being ripped apart. It was slow, certain. A beginning. When she finally pulled back, she rested her forehead against his. No one's coming to save us, are they? She whispered. No, he said, but we don't need saving anymore. Weeks passed. They found work repairing infrastructure. Him with his algorithms and circuitry, her with her hands and sharp instincts. The colony slowly grew to trust them, not because of what they said, but because of what they did. They fixed broken things. They asked for nothing in return. Sometimes they sat on the rooftop at night, looking out over the wasteland, stars breaking through the orange haze. There, with nothing left to lose and everything ahead of them, they built a life from silence. Not a perfect life, not easy, but free. And in the end, love didn't save them. It remade them. From spoils of war to something no one could own. From fragments to something whole. From ash reborn.